Hello, Hope Fellowship. Today we're talking about the Tuesday of Passion Week in the events of the life of Jesus leading up to his crucifixion. During this time, Jesus is going into the temple and he's teaching, and the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the religious leaders are all nervous about Jesus and they want to put a stop to him. They're beginning to make a plot to kill him. They even had made a plot to kill Lazarus because he was raised from the dead, and that put some question on their own power and authority compared to the power of Jesus. And so as Jesus is teaching, they would each take turns asking him questions in an attempt to trap him. And the Gospels, there's quite a bit of the Gospels that refer to this time of him going into the temple this week and teaching. And so on this day, a lot of questions are being asked of him, questioning his authority by the religious leaders. And so the first question that they ask him literally is, by what authority do you do these things? And they mean the cleansing of the temple that he did on Monday, performing the miracles that they had been hearing about, the teaching that he did in the temple with authority. By what authority do you do these things? And he said, okay, well, you answer me this question, and I'll answer you that authority question. His answer was John's baptism of God or of men? And he asked them that question because if they said, well, John the Baptist, he was from God, then he would have said, well, why didn't you believe him? And if they say, no, John the Baptist, he wasn't from God, he was of men, then they would be going against the belief that the people had that John the Baptist truly was a prophet of God and a forerunner of the coming Messiah. And so they didn't want to answer that question. And so Jesus said, well, if you don't want to answer my question, then I don't want to answer your question. And so they continued to try to find ways. They asked him another question: is it lawful to pay tax to Caesar? Now, this question was a trap, because if Jesus said, well, yeah, it's lawful to pay tax to Caesar, then that would have baffled those that were believing that Jesus was going to truly be the Messiah and overthrow the Roman government. If he's really saying, yeah, you need to pay your tax to the Roman government. But then if he said, no, you shouldn't pay the tax, then they could have trapped Jesus that way, and they could have said, see, this Jesus, he's just inciting a riot against the authority here in Jerusalem. And so they could have turned him into the Roman authorities on that basis and gotten rid of him that way. And so Jesus gives an answer, and he says to them, you hypocrites, why are you trying to trap me? And then he says, bring me a coin. And he says, whose inscription is this on this coin? And they say, well, it's Caesar's. So he says, well, then give to Caesar what's Caesar's, and give to God what is God's. And he baffles them, and the people are so impressed with his wisdom and his teaching, and they're amazed at the answer that he gives in these entrapment type questions. A group of leaders called the Sadducees came, and the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead. And so they ask a question regarding the resurrection. And they say, is there marriage at the resurrection? And they tell this story of a man who had several brothers, and this man dies. And so one of the brothers was obligated by the Mosaic law to marry that widow. And so what if that man dies, and then the next brother marries, and then so on and so forth. So finally, they all die, even the woman dies. And so at the resurrection, whose wife is this woman going to be? They're asking this question to entrap him. And Jesus' answer is classic. He says, you are in error because you do not know the scriptures or the power of God. He's basically saying the scriptures have already answered this question. And so you're in error because you don't even know the scriptures, but you're also in error because you don't know the power of God, and God has power to raise the dead, just like I raised Lazarus, and just like I'm gonna be raised come this weekend. And so he's telling them, you don't know, you're in error because you don't know the scriptures and you don't know the power of God, and that's why you don't believe in the resurrection. And he basically says there's no marriage in heaven. They're going to be like the angels. Then he goes on and he says, "But about the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what God said to you? I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He's not the God of dead people. He's the God of the living." In other words, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob aren't dead. They're still alive. And everyone will be raised up in the last day at the resurrection. And so he answers the question of the Sadducees. Another question comes where someone says, well, what is the greatest commandment? And he gives an amazing answer. He says, the first and greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And he said the second is equal to it, and that is to love your neighbor as yourself. He gave such profound answers that he shut their mouths, and they quit asking questions. And it was so amazing. But also on this day, as they're leaving the temple, Jesus began to talk about the destruction of the temple. It says in Mark 13, as they're walking away, it says, as he was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings." And Jesus said, "Do you see all these great buildings?" Jesus replied, "Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." He begins to predict the destruction of the temple of Jerusalem. And that's exactly what happened in 70 AD when the Romans came and attacked and besieged the city of Jerusalem, and they set fire to the temple. And what happened is that as the temple lit on fire, the gold that had covered most of the area of the temple began to melt, and it started melting into the crevices and the cracks of the columns and the walls of the temple and of the blocks. And so the Roman leaders basically said, hey, we want all that gold. So they commanded all the soldiers to split the wall apart, to split the rocks apart, so that they could get at all that gold that had melted in between. And so literally not one stone was left on another, and they were all thrown down. And so this prophecy became true in 70 AD at the destruction of that temple. And after leaving the temple, Jesus and the disciples went to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples began to ask him questions privately about when the destruction of the temple would take place. And in Matthew 24, verse 3, one of the disciples comes to him with the others and says, "Tell us, when will this happen, the destruction of the temple, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" And so really there's two questions being asked, even though the disciples don't realize that they're asking more than one question. They think that, well, surely all this is going to happen at the same time, the destruction of the temple and the coming back of Jesus and to the coming of the end of the age. Certainly that's the only time that the temple could be destroyed. And so Jesus gives them this answer. He gives them this foreboding message saying that the nations are going to war against each other. There's going to be great earthquakes that take place. There's going to be famine. There's going to be epidemics are going to break out. And he tells them that the disciples are going to be dragged into court and thrown into prisons, and many would be killed. And so it says this in Luke 21, "When you hear of wars and revolutions, do not be frightened. These things must happen first, but the end will not come right away." Then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, famines, and pestilences in various places, and fearful events and great signs from heaven. But before all this, they will lay hands on you and persecute you." So Jesus is answering this question, but he's laying out some distance between these events. So in other words, I'm gonna come, I'm gonna set up my kingdom, but before that, nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There's going to be famines, pestilence, earthquakes, and these are going to be the beginning of the birth pangs. But even before that, you guys are going to be persecuted, and they're going to lay hands on you. They're going to persecute you. They're going to send you to prison. Do not fear what you're going to say. At that moment, I will tell you what you need to say. And so he was basically explaining to them that these are going to be separate events. There's going to be the persecution of the disciples, the followers of God, especially after the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. And then in AD 70, the temple is going to be destroyed. And then he predicts later on is when I'm going to come. And then he talks about this thing called the abomination of desolation. And he basically says, whoever has ears to hear, let, let him hear with understanding, that when you see the abomination of desolation, and what that is you have to go back to Daniel and the prophecy of when the Antichrist begins to set up rule and begins to make pacts and treaties with the leaders of the world, and everyone begins to follow this Antichrist. And for the first 3.5 years of the 7 years of tribulation, Christians are being persecuted, but things seem to be improving for people. A lot like a lot of the despots and dictators throughout world history seem to improve things for their people for a time, and then suddenly they lower the boom and their true colors come out. And so for the first 3.5 years, these things are going to happen. There's going to be the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem, and there's going to be the regathering of the Jews back to their land, and it's going to seem like, wow, this Antichrist, he's really helping us out. And then what's going to happen is the Antichrist is going, once the temple and the sacrificial system is reestablished, he's going to do this thing that is an abomination just before he totally desolates the temple, where he offers a pig on the altar. Truly an abominable thing that was a total violation of the sacrificial system. And so when that happens, that's going to mark this change in the Great Tribulation period, and then that's when the heat is really going to get turned up and the persecution of Christians is going to ensue. And then at the end of that period is when Jesus will come and the Battle of Armageddon, and he will triumph not only over the Antichrist but also over the prince of the power of the air himself, Satan. And so Jesus talks about all of these things during this time, and he's speaking to them, and these disciples have no idea what Jesus is telling them. But of course, what Jesus is also doing is preparing us so that we would also see these things. And now that we've seen some history, the disciples have lived, have been persecuted, and have died. The temple was destroyed in AD 70. We're now in this area, the period of the Gentiles, the age of grace, we call it, where the gospel is being preached to all nations. And so these are the things that are happening. And so let's trust the Lord in the middle of these times. Let's not think that we have our full understanding locked down, like, oh, there's pestilence. That's a word that's there. Therefore, we know that the tribulation is right around the corner. We don't know this. That's what they thought in the Civil War when brother was fighting against brother. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord is a song that was written during the Civil War. They thought the tribulation was going on right at that time. And so we don't know how much more time is left, but we do know that the gospel will be preached to all nations, and we know that the gospel will not be preached unless the church does that preaching. And so you and I have a responsibility to go and tell as many people as possible about the gospel message. Let me give you something that you can do during this time while we're in isolation and we're all kind of hunkered down in our homes. Maybe you want to do what I'm doing and just make a video of your testimony of how you came to know the Lord. In fact, the Gospel Coalition has put this out where it's called Jesus Changed My Life. And if you would put that video out, just make a video of what your life was like before you became a Christian, and how it was that you came to know the Lord as your personal Savior. And just give that maybe 5 or 7 minute testimony, put that in there, and you can post that video on Facebook or social media in some way. And if you put the hashtag Jesus Changed My Life, then the people who watch that video of your testimony in your circle of friends, that they can also click on that, and they're going to see thousands of other videos of testimonies of people who have accepted Christ as their Savior and who believe in Jesus and have had their lives changed. And so this may be a way to get the gospel out all over the world to all nations. And it is exactly what needs to happen and what our job is as believers now before the Lord's return. And so let's take courage, utilize these opportunities that God gives us to encourage one another in the things of the Lord. And we will see you next time as we continue to talk about the events in the life of Jesus during Passion Week. We'll see you next time.